A health alert, Caribbean officials are reporting a dangerous dengue fever outbreak. What is the government doing to protect residents and visitors, and what can you do to protect yourself?
Having a high fever, headache, very bad muscle and joint pains.
The fallout over the CXC results, Trinidad and Tobago's education minister promises to address the concerns of students and parents. This as Guyana threatens an injunction at the Caribbean Court of Justice. FIFA suspends the Trinidad and Tobago Football Association. The suspension goes into effect immediately due to grave violations of FIFA statutes. And protests continue over the grand jury decision not to prosecute officers for killing Breonna Taylor. We'll have the reaction from the Caribbean legal community about that decision, the protests, and calls for police reform. And Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro returns to the UN, blasting the United States in his address over sanctions.
Despite tireless attacks by the U.S. empire.
And in tonight's Caribbean Moments by Caribbean Journal, as travelers return to Antigua and Barbuda, we've got the latest on the steps the government is taking to keep visitors safe.
This is the Caribbean Times News with Alicia Davis.
I'm Alicia Davis in New York. Thank you for being with us. And we begin with our headline story that dengue fever alert. Grenada's Ministry of Health is reporting a significant increase in the number of confirmed cases of dengue fever on the island, bringing that number to 20 new cases confirmed in the past week alone. Now, the increase in cases of dengue comes as neighboring St. Vincent and Grenadines grapples with an outbreak that has claimed the lives of at least 2 people. According to Health Minister Nicholas Steele, the ministry will increase its fogging operations and also ask that residents clean their surrounding areas.
The person, once infected, will start having a high fever, headache, very bad muscle and joint pains. The individual may also have abdominal pains, all right, and a few other very uncomfortable symptoms. It is a disease that can be very severe, all right?
And the fallout continues over CXC results. Thousands of students around the Caribbean are demanding a review of their CSEC-CAPE results. This after students received grades that they say are totally out of the norm. Trinidad and Tobago's education minister assures students and parents that the ministry is taking steps to address the issues. In a statement issued on Thursday, the education minister said she has spoken personally to the Caribbean Examinations Council on the matter. Now, an online petition has generated over 15,000 signatures, all demanding a review of the 2020 CXC results. And in Guyana, one school is in the process of filing an injunction to block the results.
If it means that we have to go towards the legal way, we will do that. If it means that we will petition to remove this college from writing CAPE and CSEC, we will have to do that.
Now to FIFA suspending the Trinidad and Tobago Football Association. The suspension takes effect immediately due to grave violations of FIFA statutes. The suspension was prompted by the former leader of its football association, the TTFA, lodging a claim before a local court in Trinidad and Tobago. The claim was contesting the decision of the FIFA Council to appoint a normalization committee for the TTFA. Now, coming up after the break, protests over the grand jury decision in the Breonna Taylor case. We're going to talk to attorneys, including a former prosecutor, about the case and the movement for social justice. Stay with us. And welcome back to Caribbean Times News. Well, the protests continue over the grand jury decision to let the cops off the hook for killing Breonna Taylor. You'll, of course, remember that more than 6 months ago, Breonna was shot and killed after Louisville police officers broke down the door to her apartment while executing a warrant. Well, now a grand jury has decided to indict only one of the 3 officers involved, that for firing at a neighbor's home. Now, earlier today, I spoke about this decision with legal defense attorney Mr. Eon Smith. He is a former prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Mr. Smith, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, the one officer who is being charged here is being charged for endangering Breonna's neighbors. None of the officers who shot Breonna are being charged. What do you make of that decision?
I think it's a decision that justifies all of the protests that you see going on all over the country, the anger, the frustration that is being felt by the African American community, because we have a situation which is without question that Breonna Taylor is dead. It is without question that she died at the hands of the police. But yet the one single charge that was filed against one police officer had absolutely nothing to do with Breonna Taylor's death or nothing to do with Breonna Taylor's apartment. We're talking about charging the police for endangering or recklessly discharging his firearm because he shot into the neighbor's apartment, not anything to do with the death of Breonna Taylor. And that's why people are very frustrated throughout this country.
Right. It makes it look like they value the apartment more than Breonna's actual life. But the justification that's being used here for this decision not to charge Breonna's killers is that the officers didn't shoot first, and they say thus they were justified in returning fire after Breonna's boyfriend shot at them. You are a former prosecutor. So what do you make of that justification?
Well, first of all, using the word justification, I believe, is inappropriate in this particular situation because there's nothing that they did that was justified or called for them shooting 36 rounds into Breonna's apartment. Even if someone discharged a firearm, the force that you use has to be reasonable. There's nothing reasonable about three police officers emptying their weapons into an apartment of Breonna Taylor, killing her, and then turn around and say that it was justified. There's no way that that can be justified.
Now, Kentucky's governor and Louisville's mayor are both calling for the grand jury evidence to be made public in this case. Is that something that the attorney general should do?
Absolutely. I think there are a number of questions here as to what really happened, but also, more importantly, there are questions as to what the grand jury was told. Right? We're hearing conflicting evidence about whether or not the police announced themselves. We hear from the attorney general that he had at least one witness before the grand jury that said that the police did announce themselves. But we know that there are multiple people who said that they never heard the police identify themselves as police officers. So now the question is, did the grand jury get to hear both sides? Did they get to hear all of the witnesses that said that the police did not announce themselves? Or did you just present evidence from one person that said that the police did announce themselves? These are questions that people are going to have. So the only way for you to erase those questions is to show them the evidence that was presented. What is it that the grand jury was taking into consideration when they made that decision?
And the FBI is getting involved here now. Is it possible that we could still see charges in this case?
Absolutely. The FBI can bring civil rights charges against the officers for violating Breonna Taylor's civil rights. But we have to be very concerned as a society, especially the African American community, as to whether or not this is going to result in charges actually being brought, right? Because we're looking at a situation in which the attorney general decided that he's going to present the case to the grand jury in Kentucky, which he has the right to do. And the grand jury came back with just one charge against the one particular officer. This same attorney general was at the convention of the now President Trump about, a month ago, right? So we know he has very strong ties to this administration. This administration is in charge of the FBI, right? So now when this investigation is conducted, we have questions as to whether or not Mr. Trump is going to use undue influence. We know that he doesn't respect the FBI. We know he doesn't respect the CIA. We know he doesn't respect the intelligence community. So is he going to respect the findings if it is that the investigation is conducted in a fair and transparent manner? That's a question that we have. But we would still like the FBI to get involved. That way, we know that the evidence that was gathered is being looked at, hopefully objectively, by individuals who are not influenced by the local government.
And we've seen protests. What can the public do to reform the system and to bring about justice in cases like these, besides taking to the streets?
Well, voting, right? We have tremendous momentum right now. There are a number of organizations that are doing a wonderful job to get the information out to people about the importance of voting and to ensure that they do go out and vote, both in their local, state, and federal elections. But I want to also implore members of the public to answer the call. The call that I'm speaking about is jury duty. It's something that our community oftentimes look upon as being burdensome, or something that if it is that you end up serving on jury duty, you're being ridiculed because you couldn't get out of it. But jury duty, I would say, is one of the most important civic duties that we have. If you think about it, these officers at some point in time had to go before the grand jury. If the grand jury was made up of individuals from our community who understand how recklessly these police officers behave, we might have had a different outcome. If it is that we have a situation where a member of our community is going to be on trial, it is very important that we sit in judgment of them and not let someone else judge us. I believe very strongly that if police officers were of the impression that if they commit an act of violence against a member of the minority community, that minorities would sit in judgment of them, their actions would be different, right? But they don't have that fear, they don't have that concern, they don't have that worry, because they know that very rarely do we answer the call and go and serve on juries, whether it's grand jury or petit jury, which means trial jury. So I would encourage members of the public that when you get that notice in the mail and it asks you to come down to the court to serve in jury duty, that you answer that call and that you go and you do that very, very important civic duty.
So important. And Mr. Smith, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Great insight today. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
And that was legal defense attorney and former prosecutor Ian Smith. And we will have much more on the Caribbean community's reaction to the case and the protests coming up after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Caribbean Times News. As protests over the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor continue, earlier today we spoke with members of the Caribbean Attorneys Network, Moya O'Connor, Simone Archer, Cheryl Fife, and Ricardo Salmon, about the decision and calls for justice in the case. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. And first to you, Cheryl, as an attorney, what do you make of this decision to prosecute the officer for shooting into the neighbor's apartment, but no charges for the officers who shot and killed Breonna Taylor?
Well, and thank you for having us. I think it's unfortunate and sad that we are now living in a country where the life of a Black woman means nothing. And instead, the potential endangerment of people in a neighboring apartment means something more. This woman died. And to me, that's almost the definition of danger. That is the definition of danger. Someone died, but yet they sought to only indict based on the potential of what they thought was danger to someone not existing in that space. So it's sad and it's unfortunate.
And Simone, what's your reaction?
Similar to Cheryl, I do find that it's sad and unfortunate. They receive a no-knock warrant to enter a premises to look for someone who they had in their custody. And now you have the Attorney General coming out stating that they didn't get any indictment because they did knock and announce themselves. They had a eyewitness who was close by who heard that. Why would they get a no-knock warrant? Then they went and knocked and announced themselves. Additionally, you have them bringing up all these other issues in regards to the victim, right? They are victimizing the victim here when they should have been prosecuting the police for not doing what they're supposed to do. It's very sad and unfortunate, and we're seeing this again and again, and it's sad. Something has to change.
Now, Ricardo, what do you make of these calls from the governor, from the mayor, to make this grand jury evidence public?
I think it is an appropriate call. I think in order for there to be some sort of calm, some sort of confidence in the investigation, confidence in what occurred with the grand jury, confidence that all of the facts were properly laid out and that the grand jury had all of the facts necessary to make a determination, I think it is the right call. I think all of the evidence should be made public. I think the grand jury testimony should also be made public, as well as the differing ballistic tests between the state of Louisiana and the FBI. It all needs to be made public.
And now, Moya, your organization, the Caribbean Attorneys Network, has participated in protests. Why did you decide to form this organization, and why is it so important to you all to be a part of this movement?
The reason why the organization was formed, myself and Ricardo, we formed this organization together, was that we wanted to create a home where law students, attorneys, and legal professionals could basically be themselves and feel open to speak about issues that were affecting them, network with each other, and also try to make change wherever we can. I mean, we're all attorneys. We do the day-to-day, we're litigators. We do the day-to-day, but we do have a duty as attorneys and as people of color and as West Indians, coming from our cultural background, to speak out and be vocal and really put a stamp on society whenever we can, which is why we hold various Know Your Rights forums in regards to immigration, in regards to police brutality and the social injustice, because we do have a duty as attorneys to help wherever we can.
And Moya, following up on that, I mean, we've seen dozens of people arrested in Brianna's hometown of Louisville, Kentucky during these protests. So as attorneys, how can protesters protect themselves when they are dealing with the police in situations like this?
The best way to protect yourself, of course, is to engage in peaceful protests. At the start of these protests this year in 2020, there was a lot of looting, a lot of burning down of buildings. And while we understand, of course, where this anger comes from, and a lot of this anger, I believe, is justified, we do have to make sure that we are following the law in our protests and doing peaceful protests. And what we did as an organization was that we released a list of criminal defense attorneys and civil rights attorneys who different people could consult to discuss their legal needs and the ramifications of the different protests that they were participating in.
And Simone, what is your message to the protesters? What would you like them to know?
My message to the protesters is, when you're out there, be safe. You're standing up for something that's right, for just. Be safe. Make sure you wear your PPE. Make sure you have contact information for an attorney or a family member. And it's best if you could write that information somewhere on your body. So if you're detained, they're going to take your cell phone. They'll take your wallet. They'll take all of that. So if you write it on you in a marker or something, you'll still have that information so you can reach out to someone if you are arrested, so that they can get an attorney down there to defend you as soon as possible. You don't want to be lost in the system.
So important. You want to be prepared. Ricardo, now I know that you have a town hall event coming up that is focusing on social justice. It's called Where Do We Go From Here? Tell us more about that.
Well, essentially, the town hall is going to be an opportunity for people to figure out what the next steps are. We're going to have, attorneys who can elaborate both on what is necessary in order to have real change, right? Because it doesn't matter if we protest and protest and protest. We have to ask, where are we going from this point on? What are the systemic changes that we want to see? And how do we get there in a coherent and effective manner? So I think that is what the basis of the town hall meeting will be. And I hope that people will actually attend.
Now, Cheryl, Ricardo mentioned it there, besides protesting, is there anything that the public can do to advocate for reform and those systemic changes and justice in a case like this?
They've got to get out and vote. That is going to be key, especially in this election year. Their voices count. They need to understand that the only way we can begin to affect change is for their voices to be heard. And for their voices to be heard, they have to go to the polls. It's really just that simple. They have to vote.
And that town hall, Where Do We Go From Here, is happening September 30th, live in person and streaming on Zoom. You can find all the details on CaribbeanAttorneys.org and CaribbeanTimesNews.com. And welcome back to Caribbean Times News. In a virtual address to the United Nations, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro called the United States, quote, the most serious threat facing a multipolar world. The speech marks Maduro's return to the world stage, and it comes as Venezuela's economy is reeling, in part from the U.S. sanctions imposed on the country. Maduro also spoke about the border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana.
As a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council, through sovereign majority vote of the countries represented in the UN system, despite tireless attacks by the US empire and its supporters, has further reaffirmed our commitment to promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms of every individual without any distinction, and to do so in a just and fair manner. We firmly support any initiative to combat discrimination based on ethnicity, gender, nationality, or any other related form of intolerance. We are committed to defending the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and the non-politicization and non-selective nature of implementing these principles. We are committed to international, intercultural, constructive dialogue to promote and protect all human rights. Of course, this includes the right of peoples to comprehensive development. Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela reaffirms its commitment to a peaceful solution of disputes in accordance with the principles established in the UN Charter. And with regard to the territorial dispute over Guyana Esquiva, Venezuela reiterates its strict compliance with the Geneva Agreement of 1966. In particular, we underscore the purpose, the object, and the soundness of this Geneva Agreement, which clearly is mandated to find a practical, satisfactory, and acceptable solution for both parties.
And in tonight's Caribbean Moments by Caribbean Journal, tourism is on the rise in Antigua and Barbuda. The Ministry of Tourism, Charles Fernandez, is reassuring visitors that the country is carefully monitoring for COVID-19. He says that all hotels and accommodations have been inspected by the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Health. That's to ensure that they are adhering to proper COVID-19 protocols. And that brings us to the conclusion of this broadcast. From all of us at the Caribbean Times News, thank you for joining us and have a great weekend.